Hey everyone. Tonight, we're starting with something a little less academic and a lot more herbal. A slow walk into the foggy, fragrant world of medieval intoxication. Yes, it happened. And no, it wasn't always pretty. Sometimes it was strange, sometimes dangerous, and occasionally surprisingly creative. Before you settle in, feel free to like the video and subscribe. Only if you genuinely enjoy what we do here. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see how far these stories travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It's easy to imagine the Middle Ages as a grim parade of mud, monks, plagues, and potatoes. But beneath the wool and the despair lived real people. Curious, exhausted, experimental people who occasionally looked at a strange root or a cloudy drink and thought, well, let's see what happens if I mix this with hot wine. And honestly, who could blame them? There was no electricity, no coffee, no antidepressants. Entertainment was limited to watching a knight struggle to read, or wondering how long your neighbor could dance before collapsing from ergot poisoning. So if someone told you there was a mushroom that could make you forget the feudal system for a few hours, you probably would have tried it too. Contrary to modern assumptions, using substances to ease pain, expand the mind, or simply make the day slightly less miserable wasn't unusual at all. It was woven directly into daily life. It just wasn't called getting high. There were no medieval stoner duos giggling behind haystacks. Instead, it came wrapped in terms like visionary states, divine inspiration, pain relief, or, when things went wrong, divine punishment. Doctors prescribed herbs. Monks cultivated them. Witches, depending on who you asked, applied them. Almost everyone encountered these substances at some point, through medicine, religious rituals, or the accidental consumption of moldy bread. And the medieval menu went far beyond a tankard of warm ale, though that certainly helped. There were roots that screamed, flowers that blurred vision, seeds that promised prophetic dreams, and ointments that convinced people they were flying naked through the night sky with Satan's catering staff. Getting high wasn't always recreational. It was medicinal, spiritual, or sometimes just the result of very poor judgment on an empty stomach, depending on your social status. It might be administered by a physician, a nun, or a barefoot peasant named Wolf who claimed he learned everything from a particularly wise squirrel. In the medieval world, you didn't need a dark alley or a velvet rope to access mind-altering substances. All you needed was a garden, a fire, and a vague disregard for dosage. All you needed was a garden, a mortar and pestle, and a vague disregard for dosage. Because in those days, nature was the dealer, and she wasn't always gentle. Medieval Europe was overflowing with plants, roots, fungi, and resins that could either cure your headache or make you believe you'd married a tree. The line between medicine and mystical trip was, let's say, artistically interpreted. Physicians, monks, midwives, and wandering herbalists all dabbled in botany with varying levels of training and enthusiasm. If you wanted something to knock you out, calm your nerves, or make you see God in your soup, they had options. Take henbane, for example. This plant was like nature's version of Russian roulette. Properly prepared, it eased pain and brought on sleep. Improperly prepared, it introduced you to an entirely new set of problems, like convulsions and a strong desire to remove your own shoes while running through the woods screaming. Or mandrake, the root shaped vaguely like a human figure. Legend said it screamed when pulled from the ground, a noise so lethal it could kill a man. That didn't stop people from digging it up anyway, usually by tying it to a dog and standing far away. Ingesting mundura could induce unconsciousness, visions, and on a good day, prophetic dreams. On a bad day, well, you wouldn't be needing herbs anymore. Then there was belladonna, also known as deadly nightshade, which is exactly the kind of name that screams maybe not. It was used to dilate pupils for beauty, but also to treat pain, cause hallucinations, and on occasion, death. Medieval self-care was a bold business. These herbs were often combined into teas, tinctures, oils, or those famous flying ointments we'll get to soon. And they weren't always consumed voluntarily. Sometimes they were applied during religious ceremonies, medical procedures, or by a well-meaning apothecary who thought a little extra root can't hurt. But hurt it could. Henbane, the medieval equivalent of Let's see what this button does. Known to botanists as Hymus niger, and to everyone else as the stuff that made Uncle Bernard think he was a duck, henbane was a staple of the Middle Ages' unofficial pharmacy. Used across Europe for centuries, henbane wasn't just a casual plant. It was a mood. Monks recorded its properties in herbals. Physicians used it to dull pain. Witches used it to ride broomsticks through their imaginations. And peasants. Peasants mostly hoped not to eat it by accident. So, what exactly did henbane do? Well, that depends. In small doses, it acted as a sedative. It could ease toothaches, help with insomnia, and make childbirth slightly less traumatic. In other words, it was the medieval version of take two, and try not to scream. But in larger doses, or just poorly timed ones, henbane could cause delirium, hallucinations, wild agitation, and in some cases, a heartfelt conversation with a turnip you thought was your deceased grandmother. It contains scopolamine and hyoamine, which interfere with neurotransmitters in the brain. To put it non-scientifically, your medieval brain gets weird fast. Visual distortions, disorientation, dry mouth, extreme thirst, and spontaneous outbursts of interpretive dance were all on the menu. Henbane was often smoked, brewed into teas, or even combined with fat, and smeared on the skin, a popular delivery method for anyone who didn't like their consciousness arranged in a linear fashion. Now, was it legal? Technically, yes. Controlled substances weren't a thing yet, but it was controversial, especially with the church. Anything that altered perception was suspicious. Visions were supposed to come from saints, not shrubs. Still, henbane had fans among healers, mystics, and people with nothing to lose. It even made its way into beer recipes before being banned in favor of safer additives like hops. Few plants in the medieval world were as feared, revered, and dramatically misunderstood as mundera, a root so potent and weirdly human-shaped that it sparked a mix of bodhi, folklore, and sheer panic. Botanically known as Mandura icinarum, the mandrake was associated with sleep, hallucinations, fertility, and a high probability of either mystical visions or waking up in a ditch next to a confused goat. Either way, something happened. Medieval herbalists believed that the root, which often resembled a stubby, contorted human figure, contained powerful magical and medicinal properties. It was a sedative, an anesthetic, an aphrodisiac, and according to some, a conduit to prophetic dreams. You could boil it in wine to calm pain, or you could inhale its fumes and immediately question all your life decisions. But the real fame of the mundera came from its alleged habit of screaming when uprooted. Yes, screaming as in, don't pull me out of the dirt or you'll die from the noise. Kind of screaming. Medieval texts warned that simply hearing the mandrake's cry could kill a man, which naturally led to some creative harvesting techniques. The most famous involved tying the root to a dog, walking away, and letting the poor animal do the dirty work. The assumption was that the dog would die instead of you, a plan that raises some ethical red flags, even by medieval standards. Once harvested and the dog properly mourned, the mundera could be dried, powdered, steeped, or worn as a charm. Some people even carried tiny mundera figures in pouches to ward off evil or promote fertility, because nothing says romance like a mummified root that sounds like it's seen things. The church predictably didn't love mandrakes. Anything that caused visions and wasn't tied to organized religion was treated as witchcraft adjacent. Still, monks recorded mandrake recipes in herbals with suspiciously detailed instructions. Used correctly, mundera could dull pain before surgery, treat insomnia, and create trippy, vivid dreams. Used incorrectly, it could cause vomiting, unconsciousness, or your family staging an exorcism because you thought your soup was whispering. Let's say you were a medieval noble woman hoping to attract attention at a feast. You could wear your best linen. You could braid flowers into your hair. Or if you were really serious, you could drip literal poison into your eyes. Enter belladonna, also known as atrapelladonna, or more honestly, deadly nightshade. The name alone sounds like a final boss in a medieval RPG. And yes, it was both alluring and lethal. The botanical equivalent of a seductive but unstable X. The name belladonna means beautiful lady because when a few drops of its extract were added to the eyes, it dilated the pupils. Wide eyes were considered attractive, mysterious, and maybe even a little saintly. Of course, The downside was blurry vision, light sensitivity, and the occasional unintended. But hey, beauty standards have never been particularly forgiving. Cosmetics aside, belladonna had other talents. It was used as a painkiller, a sleep aid, and occasionally as a truth serum. Though the truth it produced was often along the lines of the ceiling is dripping Latin prayers. The plant contains atropine and scopolamine, both of which mess with the nervous system in ways that range from mildly trippy to why is the wallpaper vibrating. It was a common ingredient in potions, flying ointments, and some very questionable medical procedures. Want to numb a patient before soaring off a limb? Belladonna. Want to simulate a death-like sleep for theatrical or suspicious purposes? Belladonna. Want to accidentally meet a few saints and possibly the devil in your dreams? You get the idea. And yet, despite its toxicity, belladonna was part of the medieval medical toolkit. Physicians used it carefully or recklessly, depending on how bad the plague was that week. And it shows up in herbless, recipes, and love charms across Europe. Before modern edibles came in discreet packaging and fruity flavors, medieval folks were already getting inventive, just not with chocolate. Instead, they relied on ointments, balms, tinctures, and potions. And let's be clear, the word ointment rarely inspires confidence, especially when it contains ingredients like belladonna, fat from a black cat, and a questionable amount of hemlock stirred counterclockwise under a full moon. Welcome to the world of medieval transdermal delivery systems, or in plain English, rubbing weird paste on your skin and hoping for the best. These concoctions weren't made for a casual weekend buzz. Many were tied to rituals, folk medicine, and spiritual experiences. They could knock you out, send you into ecstatic trances, or if misused, cause you to believe you're turning into a lizard. Application was often topical, which sounds safer, until you learn the preferred absorption points were the mucous membranes. Yes, those membranes. Cue the infamous flying ointments associated with witches. A lovely blend of henbane, mandrake, belladonna, and pig fat, often applied to, let's just say, intimate areas. The goal, a euphoric sensation of flying. The result, either a transcendent astral journey or waking up in a haystack with half your teeth and no memory of how you got there. Beyond the salves, medieval potions were often consumed in wine, broth, or some liquid that smelled like regret. Apothecaries loved mixing poppy extract with spiced wine, a combo strong enough to numb you during surgery or give you a front row seat to a divine revelation you didn't ask for. And let's not forget the elixir sold by wandering quacks. These traveling pharmacists promised to cure everything from heartbreak to plague, often using recipes that could also dissolve a shoe. Did they work? Maybe. Or maybe they just made you forget what was wrong in the first place. The magic of these medieval edibles was that no one could quite predict the outcome. Would you sleep peacefully, commune with angels, or scream at the moon and swear eternal loyalty to a turnip? Only one way to find out. Let's talk about the broomstick, that iconic airborne companion of the medieval witch. It might seem quaint now, the stuff of fairy tales and Halloween costumes, but back then it came with an awkwardly scandalous backstory. Spoiler, the broomstick wasn't just for sweeping. The connection between witches and broomsticks actually has chemical roots. And no, not just Mundura. Historical records, especially those written by suspicious inquisitors, describe witches using flying ointments, thick trance-inducing salves made from plants like henbane, belladonna, and dura, all of which are about as friendly as a drunk porcupine. But here's the kicker. These ointments weren't taken by mouth. Why? Because the ingredients were toxic and stomachs are famously ungrateful. Instead, they were applied topically. And by topically, we mean mucous membranes. And by mucous membranes, we mean, yes, exactly what you're thinking. Hence the broomstick, or as some sources delicately phrased it, a staff anointed for transportation. The handle was used as a vehicle for applying the ointment to areas with high absorption. Not exactly PG, but highly effective. Within minutes, users reported visions of flying through the night sky, attending feasts with the devil, or simply hovering above the village like the world's most confused drone. Of course, these were hallucinations, but in an age where medicine, magic, and mysticism shared a bunk bed, no one questioned it much. Inquisitors and theologians took note. Of course, not because they were interested in pharmacology, but because they saw flying as evidence of consorting with demons, which is ironic considering the hallucinations were chemically induced and deeply unreliable. But when has medieval justice ever needed evidence? While medieval Europe was busy applying poison to broomsticks and calling it air travel, something far more sophisticated was happening to the south and east in the flourishing cities of the Islamic Golden Age. Enter hashish, the plant-based answer to existential dread and camel traffic. Derived from cannabis resin, hashish was widely used in regions like Persia, Egypt, and the Levant. And unlike Europe's rub this on your elbow and meet Satan approach, Islamic scholars, mystics, and physicians actually documented its effects with a level of detail that suggests field testing. Hashish was often consumed orally, usually mixed with honey, spices, or other herbs, making it the first edible to actually taste good, as opposed to medieval Europe's tradition of bitter teas and things that smelled like spoiled socks. Its use wasn't just recreational, though yes, that absolutely happened. Hashish was often tied to Sufism, the mystical branch of Islam, where practitioners sought spiritual union with the divine. Hashish was believed to help dissolve the ego, clear the mind, and initiate deep contemplation, or at the very least encourage long, thoughtful stares at walls. In fact, many Sufi poets and philosophers spoke of hashish, the way modern songwriters speak about bad breakups with intense emotion, abstract metaphors, and just enough fog to make you wonder if they were okay. Of course, not everyone was a fan. Many Islamic rulers tried to ban hashish use periodically, fearing it led to laziness, moral decay, or people giggling too much during prayer. But like most substance bans in history, this had roughly the same success rate as teaching a cat to juggle. The legendary Hashin, the original assassins, were even said to have used hashish before missions to get into the proper mindset for stabbing. That claim's mostly myth, but it's a great example of how cannabis-based products were already wrapped in both mystique and suspicion. Meanwhile, Europe was centuries away from understanding how to use cannabis without immediately setting something on fire or calling it devil grass. When you picture a medieval church, you might imagine stained glass, flickering candles, solemn chanting, and that thick, almost otherworldly cloud of incense wafting through the air like God's personal fog machine. But incense wasn't just about holiness. It also had a little something extra: psychoactive potential. Let's start with the two heavy hitters: frankincense and myrrh, both resinous substances imported from the Arabian Peninsula and East Africa, burned in churches, temples, and royal courts. They were meant to cleanse the air, ward off evil spirits, and make everything smell slightly less like unwashed wool and fish stew. But here's the twist. Modern studies have shown that burning frankincense releases compounds, particularly in sinsol acetate, that can affect the brain's limbic system. Translation: if you sat in enough smoke, Gregorian chant wasn't the only thing making your head feel floaty. In poorly ventilated medieval chapels, which is to say all of them, prolonged exposure to incense could cause a mild tranquilizing effect, especially if paired with fasting, dehydration, or extreme boredom. It wasn't uncommon for monks or devotees to report visions during long services. And while they often credited divine inspiration, it's possible some were just lightly buzzed from resin fumes. And if you think this was limited to Christian spaces, think again. Incense was a common fixture in mosques, synagogues, Buddhist temples, and even pre-Christian pagan rites. It transcended religion. Everyone loves a good vibe. Apparently, clerics insisted the incense helped lift the soul to heaven. Realistically, it may have just softened the edges of reality enough to make 5-hour sermons a bit more tolerable. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of putting on lofi beads and lighting a scented candle, but with more Latin and less chill. If there was one thing medieval people could count on, besides taxes and the occasional plague, it was alcohol. Beer, ale, wine, cider, you name it. Someone was brewing it in a wooden barrel behind their house and calling it medicine. And in a way it was. Water wasn't exactly safe to drink. Most natural sources were either contaminated or casually downstream from livestock, which meant sipping from stream was basically playing intestinal roulette. So instead, people reached for something a little more fermented. Enter small beer, the medieval version of Lakwa. but with alcohol and a much higher chance of being brewed by someone named Edith, who measured ingredients by intuition and prayer. This low-alcohol drink was consumed daily by adults and children alike, not to get drunk, but to stay alive with a light buzz and regular hydration. Of course, not all medieval alcohol was so tame. If you were wealthier or simply had fewer plans for the day, you might opt for stronger ale, honey mead, or imported wine. And yes, wine was often mixed with herbs or spices, either for flavor, medicinal effect, or just to see what happened. In monasteries, brewing beer was practically a sacred duty. Monks perfected recipes, documented fermentation methods, and taste-tested the results, often with great enthusiasm. If salvation came in pints, the Benedictines were well ahead of the curve. But alcohol wasn't just a drink. It was a lifestyle enhancer. Want to dull the pain of medieval dentistry? Hey, want to treat melancholy? Spiced wine. Want to forget you live in a drafty Havel with 6 other people and one extremely judgmental chicken? Mead, taverns, inns and roadside ale houses served as medieval therapy offices, only with more yelling. People drank to celebrate, mourn, gossip, and occasionally invent entirely new dance styles no one asked for. Sometimes getting high in the Middle Ages wasn't a decision. It was just breakfast. Enter ergot, a parasitic fungus that grows on rye and other cereal grains. To the untrained medieval eye, it looked like a slightly weird blackened kernel. To the modern scientist, it's a biological prank with side effects that read like a medieval curse. Convulsions, hallucinations, burning limbs, and occasionally the sensation that your hands have turned into spiders. This fungus was the accidental ingredient in what some historians call the original LSD trip. Centuries before the Summer of Love, Woodstock, or anything with tie-dye, people in parts of Europe, especially in colder, damp regions like France and the Germanic territories, frequently baked bread from infected rye. Why? Because hunger trumps fungus awareness. And so, entire villages would unknowingly ingest ergot-laced loaves. And the results were both spectacular and horrifying. There were 2 forms of erotism. Yes, it had a name. Convulsive erotism, characterized by muscle spasms, seizures, hallucinations, and fits of laughter or panic. Gangrenous ergotism, where blood flow was cut off, leading to limbs blackening, shriveling, and falling off. Not ideal for dinner parties. Local outbreaks led to bizarre public behavior, including dancing plagues, where groups of people danced uncontrollably for days, sometimes until death. At the time, it was blamed on demons, divine punishment, or moral weakness. But in reality, it may have just been a mass case of unintentional mushroom toast. Ironically, the Order of St. Anthony, which ran hospitals for the afflicted, helped treat victims of erotism, often by feeding them wheat-based diets instead of rye. So, yes, the cure was different bread. Did people connect the dots? Not really. To a medieval baker, bread was either fine or definitely possessed, and no one was testing for psychoactive alkaloids in their porridge. They were too busy trying not to be excommunicated. Even today, some scholars believe ergot played a role in the Salem witch trials. Hallucinations, fits, paranoia, all very ergoty. But that's still debated. What's not debated? Medieval Europe got high on toast and didn't even know it. You've heard of magic mushrooms. You've heard of flying ointments. But have you ever heard of mad honey? Yes. In a few special corners of the medieval world, even the bees were in on it. This wasn't your average grocery store honey, mind you. We're talking about a rare type produced in the mountainous Black Sea regions of Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, where bees feasted on rhododendron flowers, pretty pink blooms with a dark secret. They're laced with granitoxins, naturally occurring compounds that don't play nicely with the human nervous system. The result, mad honey, a substance so potent it could bring on dizziness, hallucinations, vomiting, slowed heart rate, and spiritual visions, usually in that order. Consumed in small doses, it offered a mild buzz. In larger doses, it turned your day into a slow-motion opera starring your own eyebrows. This wasn't just a local curiosity. It was weaponized. According to ancient and medieval sources, invading armies were once deliberately poisoned with mad honey left behind in abandoned villages. Soldiers thought they'd scored free snacks. Instead, They ended up convulsing on the forest floor, realizing too late that Buick is not to be trusted. Greek and Roman authors like Xenophon and Strabo wrote about these effects centuries earlier, but the use persisted well into the Middle Ages. Locals knew how to handle the stuff. A little on bread for a headache, a little in wine for visions, or none at all if you actually wanted to remember your own name by dusk. Mad honey became known as a remedy and a recreational substance, especially in mystical or folk healing traditions. Some users claimed it brought prophetic dreams, while others just woke up clutching a potato they believed was their uncle. Results varied, and yes, it was traded. Some ambitious merchants sold it in small ceramic jars, usually without dosage instructions, because who needs warning labels when you live in an era where leeches are considered sophisticated medicine? Not everyone in the Middle Ages was a priest, a noble, or a plagirian peasant. Some folks operated in the shadowy margins of society as shamans, herbalists, cunning folk, and other semi-legitimate practitioners of medicine and mischief. Think of them as medieval pharmacists with zero regulation and a deep personal relationship with moss. These were the people you visited when the local physician suggested bloodletting for your toothache. They had no degrees, but they had herbal knowledge passed down through generations, often learned by watching grandma treat boils with bark and dignity. And when it came to mind-altering substances, these folks were your go-to. They knew which plants to grind into paste, which roots to soak in wine, and how much of a given herb would make you dream of angels instead of accidentally join them. Whether you were looking to relieve pain, induce visions, curse your neighbor, or have an out-of-body experience during laundry, they had a remedy or three. Many of these practitioners were women, midwives, wise women, and healers who were essential to their communities and deeply feared by authority figures. Not because they were cackling in cauldrons, but because they knew too much and didn't need Latin to explain it. Their remedies often included henbane, mandrake, belladonna, and poppy derivatives. They'd mix them with wine, fat, honey, or spit. Not kidding. Chant a few protective phrases and send you on your way with something that could either heal you or make you passionately confess to crimes you never committed. Of course, if anything went wrong, say a hallucination involving flying goats or the sudden urge to marry a tree, blame shifted quickly from bad batch to witchcraft. The church and local authorities kept one eye on these folk and the other eye nervously twitching. Still, communities relied on them. When your child had a fever, when your joints ached, or when you needed to contact a dead relative to ask where they hid the rent money, these were the people you turned to. They weren't doctors. They weren't priests. They were the original underground wellness influencers. So, after all, the salves, brews, roots, ointments, incense, bees, and questionable bread, one big question remains. How did medieval people actually feel about getting high? The answer: conflicted. Deeply, hilariously conflicted. For some, especially healers and herbalists, mind-altering substances were a practical tool. If it dulled pain, slowed a fevered mind, or made childbirth 1% less horrifying, it was welcomed. This was medicine, not mischief. Sure, the patient might start reciting psalms backward or insisting the cat was speaking French, but if the swelling went down, success. Then there were the spiritual users, monks, mystics, and those dabbling in divine communication. For them, hallucinations weren't red flags. They were revelations. Visions were signs of sanctity, not symptoms. If you stared into the void and the void whispered back in Latin, you were on the fast track to sainthood, or at the very least getting your own chapel mural. But intent mattered. Getting high by accident? Fine. Getting high to see Jesus? Acceptable. Getting high to flirt with a goat demon? Now we have a problem. That's where the church stepped in, branding certain substances and their users as suspicious at best, heretical at worst. Anything associated with loss of control, be it intoxication, trance, or inconvenient honesty, raised clerical eyebrows. Saints could have visions. Peasants probably just possessed. Meanwhile, among the common folk, opinions were more relaxed. Your neighbor's sleeping potion may have doubled as a psychedelic nightcap. People used poppy wine for pain, hashish for calm, and henbane tea for dealing with the in-laws. It wasn't seen as mystical or rebellious. It was just part of the medicine chest, right next to the garlic and prayers. Ultimately, how the high was viewed came down to who you were, what you were using, and whether anyone tattled. In the medieval mind, altered states lived in a weird gray area between miracle and misdemeanor, health and heresy. And in a world where demons, saints, plagues, and turnip famines all walked hand in hand, a little herbal escape now and then, hardly the worst idea. In the ancient world, the sea wasn't a void to be crossed. It was the beating heart of empire. It carried grain, gold, messages, soldiers, and sometimes war. Whoever commanded the seas didn't just own the water. They dictated the fate of entire civilizations. Unlike land warfare, where terrain-shaped battles, naval warfare was about control, of flow, of trade, of communication, and of access. For seafaring empires like Athens, Carthage, and Egypt, naval supremacy wasn't optional. It was existential. Without fleets, cities were vulnerable to isolation, starvation, and siege. With fleets, they could blockade enemies, protect merchant convoys, and even land forces deep behind enemy lines. Take the Mediterranean as an example. It wasn't called the Middle Sea for nothing. This inland ocean connected 3 continents and countless cultures. To dominate, it meant having a finger on the pulse of everything from Phoenician trade routes to Roman grain shipments. The sea could bring wealth as swiftly as it could deliver disaster. That's why ancient powers poured resources into naval infrastructure, harbors, shipyards, dry docks, and naval mines. For Athens, the navy became its lifeblood. The Mysticles vision of a triumph-powered military turned Athens into Athaloscracy, a sea-based empire. Its ships guarded grain routes from Egypt, levied tribute from allies, and crushed Persian ambitions at battles like Salamis. Carthage, on the other hand, emerged as a naval titan for merchant routes. Its dockyards were among the most advanced of the ancient world, producing warships on an almost industrial scale. Carthaginian dominance wasn't just about military power. It was backed by generations of sailors and navigators who understood the sea like a second skin. Egypt, with its strategic location in the mouth of the Nile and Red Sea, also relied heavily on fleets to protect trade with the Levant and Nubia. Although more riverine in orientation, Egyptian warships evolved into seafaring vessels capable of skirmishing with pirates and escorting treasure ships. In all these cases, naval warfare wasn't a sideshow. It was the main event. The sea was where rivals clashed, alliances were broken, and empires either flourished or floundered. Mastery of naval tactics, technology, and geography gave rise to legends. And when those fleets burned or sank, so too did the fortunes of the mighty. The Triumph was not just a ship, it was a weapon. Sleek, fast, and deadly, it defined ancient naval warfare across the Mediterranean. And though many city-states built them, none wielded them quite like the Athenians. With 3 tiers of OES and a bronze-tipped ram, the Tri was the ancient equivalent of a guided missile, one powered by sweat, rhythm, and strategy. A typical Tri measured about 120 feet long and just 18 feet wide. Narrow, yes, but that was the point. Its slim hull allowed it to slice through water with minimal drag, while its low draft let it operate close to shore for raids and landings. The name Tri comes from its 3 rows of OES stacked vertically. These weren't random rowers either. Each was a trained seaman knowing how to move in unison at speeds of up to 9 knots in battle. The Triumph's most fearsome feature, the ram, a bronze sheathed prow reinforced with oak, designed to smash into enemy hulls with devastating force. But ramming wasn't just about speed. It required precise timing and angle. Hit too straight, and your own ship might get stuck or even capsize. Skilled captains like those in the Athenian Navy perfected the art of the Dicklaus, a maneuver that involved slipping through enemy lines, turning quickly, and striking exposed flanks. Above deck, the Tri carried a small contingent of Marines, usually around 10 to 20 heavily armed hoplites and a few archers. Their role was to board enemy vessels or defend against boarding. But make no mistake, a Tri was not a floating fortress. It relied on agility, not armor. One wrong move, and you were kindling. What made the Athenian Tri fleet truly revolutionary wasn't just the ship itself. It was the system behind it. funded by the Theorica, a public naval fund. Athens built and maintained hundreds of trims. Citizens, even the poorest, serve as rowers, creating a strange kind of democracy at sea. When Athens beat the Persian fleet at Salamis in 480 BC, it wasn't aristocrats who rode to victory. It was the common people. Ancient naval combat wasn't a cannon-blasting slugfest. It was more like high-speed chess with the occasional street brawl. The primary goal: disable or sink the enemy before they could do the same to you. And the main tool for that: ramming. Ramming was the centerpiece of naval tactics in the Tri-era. The goal was to pierce an enemy's hull below the waterline using the ship's bronze-tipped prow. A well-placed ram could send a vessel to the bottom in minutes. But it wasn't as simple as charge forward. Timing, angle, and coordination mattered immensely. Too sharp an approach, and you glance off. Too direct, and you might embed your ship in theirs, leaving both vessels vulnerable. To land a successful ram, fleets used complex maneuvers like the dak plow and peripolis. In its class, a ship would dart through gaps in the enemy line, then pivot to strike from behind. The peripolis involved circling around the enemy formation to hit exposed flanks. These weren't brute force tactics. They were precision strikes dependent on the rower's synchronization and the captain's foresight. But sometimes things didn't go to plan. Rams missed. Ships locked together. OES snapped. That's when Plan B came in. Boarding. Boarding turned the naval fight into a land-style melee. Once two ships collided or locked, Marines would leap aboard the enemy vessel with swords, spears, and shields. These weren't delicate affairs. Boarding was brutal, close-quarters combat, more like a gang brawl than an orderly phalanx. Archers and slingers added chaos from the upper decks, picking off anyone who showed too much helmet. Some fleets, like those of the Romans, eventually favored boarding over ramming. They even built special devices like the corvus, a boarding plank with a spike that could hook onto enemy ships and turn sea battles into floating land fights. This tactic helped Rome defeat more experienced Carthaginian sailors during the First Punic War, because what Romans lacked in seamanship, they made up for in sheer infantry strength. Of course, this also meant naval battles became even bloodier and more chaotic. There was no retreat once boarding began. It was kill or be killed on a deck slick with salt water, blood, and broken timbers. If ramming was the scalpel of ancient naval warfare, then fire was its sledgehammer. There was no more terrifying sight than a flaming ship bearing down on your fleet. Fire ships were the naval world's version of controlled chaos, a weapon so dangerous that it often threatened the attacker as much as the enemy. Though not as common as triumphs or boarding actions, fire tactics emerged early and evolved over time. The basic principle was simple: load a ship with flammable materials, pitch, tar, sulfur, resin, oil, and set it alight before sending it toward enemy vessels. Ideally, the fire ship would drift into tightly packed enemy lines, igniting sails, decks, and anything else unfortunate enough to be flammable. One of the earliest documented uses of fire ships comes from the Greco-Persian conflicts, where desperate defenders tried to repel naval invasions by hurling flaming rafts or boats toward enemy galleys. In the confined spaces of a harbor or strait where maneuverability was limited, a single fire ship could cause mass panic and break formations. But fire at sea was a double-edged sword. Winds could shift, flames could backfire. A poorly timed fire ship could destroy your own fleet as easily as the enemy's. This is why fire was often reserved for desperate moments, blockades, surprise attacks, or last stands where the risk was worth the havoc. The most sophisticated development in ancient incendiary warfare came with Greek fire, a mysterious and fearsome weapon developed by the Byzantine Empire centuries later, but inspired by ancient fire tactics. Greek fire could allegedly burn on water and couldn't be extinguished with standard methods. While it's more medieval than ancient, its conceptual roots, chemical fire used in naval dominance, could be traced back to these early fire ships. Egyptian and Phoenician fleets also used variations of fire-based weapons, particularly against pirate vessels and during sieges. For instance, coastal defenders might catapult fire pods or flaming arrows onto ships attempting to breach harbors. The psychological effect of fire at sea was unmatched. A ram could be blocked, A border could be repelled. But fire? Fire panicked crews, devoured wooden hulls, and spread faster than orders could be shouted. Even the most experienced sailors might abandon ship at the first whiff of pitch and smoke. In the 5th century BCE, Athens transformed itself from a landlocked city-state into a dominant naval superpower. And it all started with silver. When a massive silver vein was discovered in the mines of Lauria Mysticals, an ambitious Athenian politician convinced his fellow citizens not to divide the wealth, but to invest it. His plan: build a fleet of triumphs, lots of them. That decision changed history. With over 200 warships at its peak, the Athenian navy became the backbone of what we now call the Athenian Empire. The city's power was no longer rooted in hoplite infantry or stone walls. It sailed on wood, sweat, and strategy. The victory at Salamis in 480 BC, where theistically fleet trapped and annihilated the Persian navy in narrow straits, is still one of the most decisive sea battles of the ancient world. That win didn't just save Athens, it positioned it as the protector and soon ruler of the Ion. Under the Dien League, Athens began extracting tribute from allied city-states, supposedly for mutual naval defense. In practice, this tribute was often used to fund Athens' own interests, from shipbuilding to public architecture. The navy allowed Athens to enforce loyalty, suppress rebellions, and project its power far beyond its borders. But it wasn't just about military might. The fleet democratized Athens. The poorest citizens who couldn't afford armor or land to fight as hoplites became essential rowers in the triumphs. Their contribution gave them political clout, transforming the Athenian assembly and empowering the lower classes. Sea power became people power. However, this dominance came at a price. Athens' over-reliance on its navy and its coercive treatment of allies sowed resentment. During the Peloponnesian War, Sparta, historically a land-based power, built its own fleet with Persian money and eventually crushed the Athenian navy at Aegospotami in 405 BC. With its fleet gone, Athens was starved into surrender. Still, the legacy of Athenian naval power endured. It showed that a city-state with limited land could become an imperial force through mastery of the sea. It also proved that ships could be political tools just as much as weapons. If Athens ruled the Ion, Carthage dominated the western Mediterranean. Founded by Phoenician settlers around 800 BCE in what is now Tunisia, Carthage built its power not on conquest alone, but on trade, seafaring, and unmatched naval innovation. By the 4th century BCE, Carthage wasn't just a wealthy city. It was the nerve center of a sprawling maritime network that stretched from Spain to Sicily and North Africa to Sardinia. Carthaginian power was made possible by its fleet. While the Athenians refined the triumph, the Carthaginians took naval engineering to industrial levels. Their shipyards, especially the vast circular harbor of Carthage, could build and house hundreds of warships. These weren't theoretical numbers. Carthage had an assembly line-style dock system that allowed for rapid construction and repair, something unprecedented in the ancient world. Carthaginian ships, often quadriremes or quinquiremes, were heavier than Athenian triremes, designed not just for speed, but for power. Their naval doctrine leaned toward ramming and boarding, supported by experienced mercenary marines and Libyan Phoenician sailors who had grown up on the sea. The city's maritime dominance wasn't only about force, it was about commerce. Carthaginian merchants navigated the Atlantic coasts of Europe and Africa, traded tin and silver, and brought back exotic goods. The navy ensured that pirates, rival traders, or Roman ambitions didn't interfere with this lucrative flow. And then came the Punic Wars. Rome, rising in the Italian peninsula, recognized that defeating Carthage meant building a navy from scratch. When they captured a stranded Carthaginian quinquireme, they reverse-engineered it, complete with a corvus, a boarding ramp that neutralized Carthage's superior seamanship by turning sea battles into land skirmishes. Despite early defeats, Carthage held its own through brilliant naval commanders and tactical mastery. In the First Punic War, the Carthaginians fought dozens of major sea battles. At Trapana, they executed a flawless maneuver that destroyed a Roman fleet despite being outnumbered, proving Carthage still knew how to command the sea. But quantity eventually overwhelmed quality. Roman persistence, better supply lines, and brutal discipline turned the tide. By the end of the Second Punic War, Carthage's fleet was gone, its shipyards dismantled, and its power broken. Still, the legend of Carthaginian naval dominance endures. They weren't just warriors on the water. They were master merchants, innovative shipbuilders, and bold navigators who once ruled the seas through wit, wealth, and wood. When we think of ancient Egypt, we picture pyramids, pharaohs, and temples, not fleets. But Egypt was one of the earliest civilizations to embrace naval power, both on the Nile and at sea. Its ships may not have been as famous as Greek trims or Carthaginian quincare, but for thousands of years, Egypt relied on watercraft to maintain its empire, transport troops, and protect its economic lifelines. The Nile was Egypt's highway, an artery that connected north and south, desert and delta. As early as 3000 BCE, Egyptian shipbuilders were crafting vessels from bundled papyrus reeds and later cedarwood imported from Lebanon. These riverboats transported grain, gold, soldiers, and even colossal statues. Pharaohs led naval expeditions southward into Nubia and eastward across the Red Sea to Punt, a mysterious land rich in incense, ivory, and exotic animals. But Egypt's naval ambitions weren't limited to the river. By the time of the New Kingdom seed in 1550-1070 BC, Egypt developed seagoing fleets capable of challenging pirates, repelling invasions, and projecting power beyond its borders. Under rulers like Thutmose III and Ramesses III, Egypt used warships in campaigns against the Sea Peoples, a confederation of raiders who threatened the eastern Mediterranean. These battles, recorded in vivid reliefs at Medinet Habu, show Egyptian archers firing from ships and marines engaging in brutal close combat aboard narrow wooden decks. Unlike the odd triumphs of Greece, Egyptian seafaring ships were broad sail-driven vessels with limited maneuverability. They often featured raised fighting platforms and were crewed by archers, spearmen, and sailors trained in both combat and navigation. Their primary advantage was mobility along coasts and rivers where they could rapidly deploy soldiers or intercept merchant traffic. Egyptian naval strength also underpinned its economy. Grain exports to the Levant and trade with the Aegean was secured by escort ships. Ports like Byblo and Tanis became hubs of both commerce and naval logistics. Even foreign rulers sought Egyptian shipbuilders for their craftsmanship. In time, Egypt's naval power waned under successive waves of foreign rule. Libyans, Assyrians, Persians, and eventually Greeks and Romans. But its long legacy of riverine and coastal warfare set the foundation for naval traditions in the ancient Near East. Egypt's ships may not have ruled the open sea, but they ruled the rhythm of empire, sailing where the Nile flowed, where the winds allowed, and where power demanded. When the Roman Republic first rose to prominence, it was not a naval power. Rome's strength lay in its disciplined legions and road-building prowess, not shipping. But that changed dramatically and rapidly when the Republic found itself in a bitter contest for control of the Mediterranean against Carthage. The result was one of the most dramatic naval transformations in ancient history. At the start of the First Punic War, 264 BCE, Rome had almost no fleet. Carthage, meanwhile, had centuries of maritime dominance. But the Romans weren't deterred. According to legend, they captured a Carthaginian quinquereme and used it as a prototype. Within months, they mass-produced a navy, assembling hundreds of ships through sheer manpower and state-level organization. But Rome knew it couldn't oust the Carthaginians. So, it changed the rules of the game. Enter the corvus, a boarding bridge fitted with a metal spike. This device turned sea battles into infantry brawls, Rome's specialty. With it, Roman Marines could board enemy ships en masse, transforming naval combat into something far more familiar to Roman soldiers. The results were dramatic. In battles like Melile and Cape Ecnomus, Rome's relatively inexperienced sailors defeated veteran Carthaginian crews through sheer aggression and the effectiveness of the corvus. Eventually, the corvus was abandoned. It made ships dangerously top-heavy, but it had already turned the tide of the war. By the Second Punic War, Rome's naval infrastructure had matured. Its fleets patrolled the western Mediterranean, protected supply lines to Iberia and Africa, and disrupted Hannibal's ability to reinforce his forces from Carthage. Naval blockades and amphibious landings became standard tactics. Under the Empire, Roman control of the seas expanded further. The classis Massanes and classis Ravenatus were two of the main imperial fleets stationed to protect trade routes, suppress piracy, and transport troops. Though not always at the forefront of warfare, the navy provided vital logistical and strategic support, keeping the empire interconnected. Unlike Athens or Carthage, Rome didn't build a maritime identity. It used the sea as a tool, something to be mastered when necessary. And yet, by the 1st century CE, the Mar Nostrum, our sea, was more than a boast. It was reality. Rome had been born on land, but its destiny was sealed on water. Through adaptation, innovation, and relentless will, it turned the sea from a vulnerability into a fortress. Ancient naval warfare didn't just influence battles. It shaped borders, economies, empires, and even cultures. Across the Mediterranean and beyond, control of the sea meant more than victory on the water. It meant influence over the movement of ideas, trade, languages, and power structures that would echo for centuries. First, consider how navies forged empires. Athens became a cultural and economic powerhouse because of its naval strength. Carthage turned maritime mastery into a mercantile empire. Rome, despite its late start at sea, used naval superiority to control the entire Mediterranean basin. Each of these powers had land armies, but it was their fleets that let them strike across continents, defend distant territories, and choke enemy economies. The sea also served as a cultural conduit. Greek colonists traveled by ship to establish outposts across Italy and Asia Minor, spreading art, religion, and language. Egyptian ships brought papyrus, gold, and sacred knowledge to foreign courts. Phoenician mariners transmitted their alphabet and their gods to nearly every shore they touched. Naval power was never just martial. It was civilizational. Technologically, ancient navies pushed shipbuilding to new heights. The development of the Tyre and later larger polyums was not just military advancement. It was a revolution in engineering. Harbors became logistical hubs. Navigation techniques improved. Standardized ship designs laid the groundwork for maritime architecture still visible in later Byzantine and Islamic navies. Even economic systems evolved because of navies. Protected sea routes allowed for stable trade across vast distances, enabling luxury goods like silks, spices, wine, and tin to move between far-flung cultures. Cities with strong fleets like Alexandria or Rhodes became wealthy cosmopolitan centers. Where fleets thrived, so did markets, artists, scholars, and revolutionaries. And then there was the psychological legacy. Fire ships, ramming tactics, boarding actions. These left lasting impressions on how warfare was imagined. They introduced the idea that the sea itself could be a weapon, that mobility and control, rather than just brute force, could win wars. Today, we remember many of these empires for their land conquests, but their sea conquests were just as vital and often more enduring. Ancient naval warfare wasn't just about who had the fastest ship or the sharpest ram. It was about who understood the sea as a stage, not just for war, but for history itself. In the end, the trims may be gone, but their wake still ripples through time. Cyrus the Great was born around 600 CE in the region of Anshan, then a vassal kingdom under Median rule. His family, the Achaemenids, claimed noble descent and ruled a small but respected Persian domain. But nothing about Cyrus's early life hinted that he would one day create one of the largest empires the world had ever seen. And yet from the very beginning, legend surrounded him. Greek historian Herodotus gives us one of the most dramatic origin stories in ancient biography. According to Herodotus, King Ios of Media, Cyrus's grandfather, had a dream that his daughter's son would overthrow him. Interpreters confirmed his worst fear. The child would be a threat to his throne. So Astyages married his daughter Mandane to a Persian noble Camby the Fur, hoping the baby would remain politically insignificant. But the dreams persisted. When Cyrus was born, Astyages took no chances. He ordered a loyal servant, Harpagus, to kill the child. Pope Harpagus, reluctant to commit such an act, delegated the gruesome task to a shepherd. But instead of abandoning the infant, the shepherd raised Cyrus as his own, hiding him in the mountains and treating him like a common herder's son. As Cyrus grew, so did his charisma. Even as a boy, he stood out, commanding other children, displaying leadership beyond his years. Eventually, rumors reached the court. A noble child living as a shepherd. Asti is investigated and the truth unraveled. Surprisingly, he spared Cyrus, perhaps seeing no threat, or perhaps haunted by guilt. Harpagus, however, was not so lucky. In a grim punishment, Aryages killed Harpagus' son and served him as a meal at court. Meanwhile, Cyrus was sent back to Persia to live under his father Cambyses' care, now recognized openly as a prince of noble blood. What the Median king didn't know was that he had just ensured his own downfall. For Cyrus's time among shepherds and nobles alike gave him a unique understanding of people, both the powerful and the humble. Whether Herodotus' version is fact or fable, the story captures the aura that would always surround Cyrus. From near death in infancy to destiny-daying survival, his early life planted the seeds of greatness. He would not only challenge Astia, but redefine kingship itself. By the mid-6th century BC, Cyrus was no longer just a Persian prince. He was a calculating and ambitious leader poised to challenge the regional status quo. At that time, the Median Empire, ruled by King Ages, still held sway over Persia. But the balance of power was shifting and Cyrus was ready to tip the scales. The catalyst was betrayal. According to multiple sources, including Herodotus and the Babylonian Chronicle, the Median general Harpagus, the very man ordered years earlier to kill baby Cyrus, had never forgotten the cruel fate of his son. Now, years later, he was in a position to act. Secretly, he sent messages to Cyrus, encouraging him to rise up and promising support from within the Median ranks. It was the beginning of a revolt that would shake the ancient world. Around 553 BCE, Cyrus officially rebelled. Persia, once a subordinate kingdom, now declared independence and war. What followed was not a single decisive battle, but a series of prolonged campaigns. Over 3 years, Cyrus's forces pushed deeper into Median territory, drawing support from disaffected nobles and regional allies. His reputation grew not just for military competence, but for restraint. He often spared the lives of surrendered enemies, earning both fear and admiration. Meanwhile, Astyages' court was unraveling. Loyalty eroded when the final confrontation came around 550 BCE. It wasn't the mess who triumphed. It was Cyrus. Astyages was betrayed by his own army, and the once mighty Median Empire crumbled almost overnight. Cyrus entered Ecbatana, the Median capital, not as a barbarian conqueror, but as a new kind of ruler. He respected local traditions, preserved Median administrative structures, and incorporated many-mess into his growing government. This policy of inclusion would become a hallmark of his rule. With Media under his control, Cyrus unified the Iranian plateau. But this wasn't the end. It was the beginning. By overthrowing the mess, he not only liberated Persia from vassalage, but also inherited their empire. He now ruled lands stretching from modern-day Iran to parts of Central Asia. Fresh from his triumph over the mess, Cyrus the Great turned his gaze westward toward the fabulously wealthy kingdom of Lydia, ruled by the legendary Croesus. Croesus was no ordinary king. He was one of the richest men of his time, his name becoming a byword for immense wealth. His capital Sardis gleamed with luxury, and his armies were well equipped with cavalry and seasoned troops. But Croesus made a fatal mistake. He underestimated Cyrus. Seeking to preempt Persian expansion, Croesus formed alliances with Egypt and Babylon and consulted the Oracle of Delhi. The Oracle famously told him that if he crossed the river to attack Persia, he would destroy a great empire. Encouraged, Croesus launched an invasion only to discover that the empire he would destroy was his own. The two forces clashed near the Halys River in 547 BCE. After a fiercely contested battle, Croesus withdrew to Sardis, believing the campaign season had ended and that he could regroup in the spring with allied reinforcements. But Cyrus did something unexpected. He pursued. In a bold winter campaign, Cyrus besieged Sardis, forcing Croesus into a desperate defense. According to Herodotus, Cyrus even employed a tactical surprise. He used camels to startle the Lydian cavalry, Cus's strongest asset, rendering them ineffective. Within weeks, Sardis fell. Croesus was captured alive. What happened next sealed Cyrus's reputation as a ruler unlike any other. Instead of executing Cus, Cyrus reportedly spared him, even making him an advisor. The story goes that as Croesus was about to be burned alive, he cried out Solomon's name, a Greek philosopher who once warned him not to count a man lucky until he knew how his life ended. Cyrus, moved by the tale and the wisdom in it, ordered the fire extinguished. Whether myth or truth, this narrative reflects Cyrus's known policy of clemency. With Lydia conquered, Cyrus gained control over its immense treasury and trade networks along with the powerful Greek city-states of Ionia along the Ion coast. Though the Ionian cities resisted Persian rule, they were no match for Cyrus's expanding military and diplomatic machine. The fall of Crous marked more than the collapse of a rich kingdom. It confirmed Cyrus's tactical brilliance and willingness to use both warfare and mercy. It also gave Persia a foothold in the Greek world, setting the stage for future East-West conflicts. Wax, base scents that would melt slowly in the sun, covering them in luxury. For women, hairstyles were tied to femininity, fertility, and power. A noble woman's wig might be adorned with floral decorations, colorful bands, or precious metal clasps. A priestess might wear hers in tight, symmetrical rows echoing the divine order of the gods. For men, especially those in service to Pharaoh, a thick stylized wig reflected not just wealth, but closeness to the divine hierarchy. Children, however, had their own style. Many wore the sidelock of youth, a shaved head with one ornate braid left dangling, a symbol of childhood that would be cut off during adulthood, or religious rites of passage. And then there were the bold priests. In sharp contrast to the extravagance of court wigs, priests were required to shave their entire bodies, including their heads, to maintain ritual purity. In public ceremonies, though, even they might wear ceremonial wigs, symbolizing their spiritual roles more than their individual identity. What's more fascinating is how wigs even served after death. Mummies were often buried with wigs in place, ensuring their status and beauty carried into the afterlife. Hair, in other words, wasn't just vanity. It was an eternal identity. If you picture a Viking, you likely imagine wild beards and braided hair, an image forged from equal parts archaeology, Norse sagas, and Hollywood. But there's a surprising truth in that vision. Viking hairstyles were far from random. In fact, hair was a powerful symbol in Norse society of identity, masculinity, clan loyalty, and even seduction. Both Viking men and women took their hair seriously. In a world where physical appearance projected strength and honor, long hair wasn't a vanity. It was a statement. Men often grew their hair long and styled it meticulously. Braids, top knots, and half-shaved heads weren't just stylish. They were intimidating. A warrior walking in a battle with braided locks and a thick beard wasn't just practical. Keeping hair out of the eyes, he was broadcasting his readiness to fight and his resistance to fear. For Viking women, hair could be just as symbolic. Long, well-groomed hair was a marker of femininity and high status. Women often braided their hair in complex patterns, sometimes using ribbons or beads woven into the strands. A married woman might wear her hair wrapped or partially covered to signal her marital status, similar to how wedding rings work today. Some burial sites in Scandinavia even include combs, hairpins, and grooming tools, suggesting daily care and pride in appearance were important to both sexes. There's also a fascinating legal angle. In Viking law codes, hair played a role in justice. Cutting off someone's hair without permission was considered a grave insult, one that could lead to revenge, legal retribution, or full-blown blood feuds. That's because hair represented honor. To disgrace a warrior by chopping his locks was to attack his social standing itself. And then there's mythology. The Norse gods themselves had iconic hair. Thor with his flaming red beard. Loki's transformation tricks often involve changes in hair or shape. And of course, the goddess Cyph, whose golden hair was so legendary that when Loki cut it off as a prank, he had to beg the dwarves to forge a magical replacement from real gold. Hair wasn't just mortal identity, It was divine currency. The Romans knew a thing or two about control, and that extended to their hairstyles. In a world where politics, class, and gender were all tightly regulated, hair became one of the subtlest yet most powerful tools of social navigation. Especially in elite circles, your locks could literally declare your allegiance, your values, and your ambition. Let's start with Roman man. In the early Republic, the ideal Roman citizen was clean-cut, conservative, and practical. Hair was short, tidy, and well-groomed. Anything longer than that was considered suspect, effeminate, foreign, or lazy. A short haircut and a clean-shaven face weren't just fashion choices. They were civic statements. They said, "I'm disciplined. I serve the state. I'm Roman." But as the empire progressed, things got fluffier. Emperors like Nero and Commodus let their curls grow out in flamboyant styles that mimicked Greek philosophers or even divine statues. Some sported what we now call the Roman top knot, a raised section of curled or piled hair at the front, sculpted to suggest intellect, youth, or refinement. These weren't accidents. They were carefully crafted public images. Hair became propaganda. For Roman women, the stakes were even higher. Hairstyles became almost architectural. The famous Flavian Tower style, a literal mountain of curls and braids pinned above the head, was a high-status look made possible only by slave labor, hot irons, and hours of work. The more elaborate the hairdo, the wealthier the woman because it meant she had the leisure time and servants to maintain it. Hair could also show political loyalty. Empresses often debuted new styles and statues and coinage which were then copied by upper-class women across the empire. Wearing a harrow like the empress wasn't just flattery, it was allegiance. Meanwhile, enslaved people were often forced to keep their hair short or plain, denying them this form of expression entirely. Soldiers likewise wore practical cuts, reinforcing unity and function over flair. And then there were the rebels. Some Romans deliberately grew long hair or adopted barbarian styles to show disdain for imperial values. For example, gladiators often wore dramatic hairstyles to build stage personas. Part athlete, part celebrity, part threat. In ancient Japan, hair wasn't merely a personal feature. It was an emblem of discipline, duty, and deeply rooted tradition. Nowhere was this more visible than in the iconic Sha mage, the distinctive top not worn by samurai. This wasn't just a haircut. It was a cultural contract. Originally, the Shan mage began as a practical choice. The shaved crown kept helmets, especially the kabuto. Samurai wore helmets, more comfortable and secure in battle. But over time, as peace settled in during the Edo period, the style became less about combat and more about identity. The top knot became a rigid symbol of warrior status, honor, and submission to Bushido, the way of the warrior. Cutting it off wasn't just a haircut. It was symbolic death. The disgraced samurai might be ordered to remove his top knot or do it himself as a sign that he was no longer worthy of his rank. In extreme cases, the cutting of the top knot preceded seppuku, the ritual suicide performed to atone for shame. The hair of Japanese women also conveyed powerful social messages. During the Han period, 794-1185, noble women grew their hair extraordinarily long, sometimes longer than their bodies, and allowed it to cascade straight down their backs in a style known as subarashi. This wasn't just beauty, it was elegance, patience, and status. Maintaining such length required immense care, time, and wealth, traits exclusive to the aristocracy. And for Cyrus, it was just the next step in a rapidly expanding empire. By the late 540s BCE, only one major power remained between Cyrus and undisputed dominance of the Near East, Babylon. Once ruled by kings like Hammurabi and Nebuchadnezzar II, Babylon had grown into a magnificent metropolis famed for its towering ziggurats, massive double walls, and the fabled hanging gardens. But beneath the grandeur, cracks were forming. At the time, Babylon was ruled by Nabonidus, a king deeply unpopular with his own people. His religious policies alienated the powerful priesthood of Marduk, the city's chief deity. He had spent years away from Babylon, leaving the empire in the hands of his son, Belshazzar, a name familiar to readers of the Hebrew Bible. Discontent was growing. Cyrus sensed opportunity. In 539 BCE, Cyrus launched his campaign, But unlike previous invasions marked by siege and destruction, this one was surgical. Cyrus's forces defeated Babylonian troops at Opis, a key city on the Tigris, though they won not only with military power, but with propaganda. The Persians promised to liberate the people from the misrule of Nabonidus, presenting Cyrus as a restorer of divine order. The most astonishing part, when Cyrus entered Babylon, he did so without a fight. According to the Nabonidus Chronicle and later Greek sources, the city gates were open to him, perhaps through political negotiation, perhaps due to internal betrayal. Regardless, Cyrus marched into Babylon as a liberator, not a conqueror. He respected the city's temples, participated in religious ceremonies, and declared in the famous Cyrus Cylinder that he had been chosen by Marduk himself to restore peace and justice. This document, often called the world's first charter of human rights, records Cyrus's policies of tolerance, temple restoration, and repatriation of displaced peoples. Among those affected were the Jews exiled from Jerusalem decades earlier by Babylonian kings. Cyrus issued an edict allowing them to return home and rebuild the temple in Jerusalem, an act so significant that the Hebrew Bible refers to him as God's anointed, a title otherwise reserved for Israelite kings. After entering Babylon in 539 BCE, Cyrus the Great didn't just take the throne, he rewrote the rules of empire. One of the most remarkable artifacts of his reign is the Cyrus Cylinder, a clay document inscribed in Attian Q&A form, often hailed as the world's first charter of human rights. While modern scholars debate that claim, there's no doubt that the cylinder offers a revolutionary glimpse into how Cyrus saw power, not as domination, but as stewardship. In the text, Cyrus proclaims himself chosen by Marduk, Babylon's chief deity, to restore order and justice after the misrule of Nabonidus. But this wasn't mere flattery. Cyrus backed his words with action. He restored temples to their proper function, allowed displaced peoples to return to their homelands, and explicitly stated that he would not oppress his subjects or alter their local traditions. One of the most famous outcomes of this policy was the liberation of the Jews from Babylonian exile. After decades in captivity, the Jewish people were allowed to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their destroyed temple. The book of Ezra in the Hebrew Bible records Cyrus's decree, praising him as an instrument of divine will, extraordinary for a foreign king. In fact, Cyrus is the only non-Jew referred to in the Bible as a Messiah or anointed one. The Cyrus Cylinder speaks in terms of freedom, restoration, and legitimacy through justice, a striking contrast to the standard rhetoric of ancient rulers who often glorified conquest and divine punishment. Instead of boasting about destroying cities or enslaving enemies, Cyrus highlights his role as a protector of diverse cultures and faiths. This wasn't weakness, it was strategy. By respecting local customs, he avoided rebellion and fostered loyalty across his vast empire. Although we must be cautious not to project modern legal concepts onto ancient texts, the spirit of the Cyrus Cylinder remains remarkable. It envisions a world where rulers derive legitimacy not from fear, but from benevolence and inclusion. Today, a replica of the cylinder is displayed at the United Nations headquarters, a testament to its symbolic weight as an early blueprint for pluralistic governance. Cyrus the Great didn't just conquer a vast empire, he held it together. That might sound simple on paper, but in reality, he ruled over an incredibly diverse world. Persians, Medes, Babylonians, Elamites, Lydians, Hebrews, and countless others, all with their own languages, gods, customs, and grievances. What made Cyrus truly great was not how far he extended his borders, but how skillfully he managed what lay within them. At the core of Cyrus's governance was a philosophy of tolerance through structure. Unlike many ancient rulers who imposed their culture and religion upon conquered peoples, Cyrus embraced a decentralized model. He allowed local leaders to remain in place, local religions to flourish, and local customs to continue. Rather than crush his subjects into submission, he sought to win their trust, and it worked. He retained and adapted the administrative systems of the Medes and Babylonians, blending them with Persian practices to create a uniquely flexible empire. Power was delegated to satraps or provincial governors who oversaw taxation, security, and justice in their regions. These officials were typically chosen from local elites, but remained accountable to Cyrus's central authority. This system became the foundation of Achaemenid rule for generations. Cyrus also invested in infrastructure. He improved trade routes, safeguarded caravans, and ensured fair treatment for merchants. Knowing that commerce was as essential to stability as armies, his empire wasn't just a military machine. It was an economic and cultural network that stretched from the Indus Valley to the Iron Sea. He also understood the power of symbolism. In each city he conquered, Cyrus made gestures of respect, restoring temples, participating in religious ceremonies, and preserving local institutions. These acts weren't simply theatrical. They were diplomatic strategies that earned him the loyalty of former enemies. Most remarkable was how little resistance his rule provoked. Cyrus didn't just avoid rebellions. He often inspired admiration. Even the Greeks, typically disdainful of barbarians, viewed him as a wise and just king. Xenophon, the Athenian historian, would later write Cyropaedia, a partly fictionalized but deeply admiring biography of Cyrus, presenting him as the model of enlightened leadership. By the end of his reign, Cyrus the Great had reshaped the ancient world. From the Iron Sea to the mountains of Central Asia, his empire stretched farther than any before it. But like many great conquerors, his ambition pushed him toward one final campaign, this time into the steppes of the northeast. It would be his last, around 530 BC. Later, during the Edo period, women's hairstyles became increasingly ornate and stylized. Styles like the shimada, a kind of coiled bun, were adorned with pins, combs, and decorations, each one coated with meaning. Certain styles indicated marital status, age, or even profession. Courtesans and geishas, for example, used dazzling and elaborate hairstyles not only to attract clients, but to signal their training stage and experience level. Hair could also be a form of rebellion. During certain shogunate rules, laws were passed restricting hairstyles based on class. Violating those codes, even by letting your hair grow the wrong way, could draw suspicion or punishment. And yet, artists, actors, and even ronin, masterless samurai, often bent the rules to make bold statements about identity and resistance. In ancient Japan, hair was bound literally and figuratively by duty, devotion, and drama. Whether in the silent dignity of a samurai or the elegant swirl atop a geisha's head, coiffures were acts of storytelling, honor, and deep cultural memory. Across ancient Africa, hair wasn't just a personal style. It was a language. From the intricate cornrows of the Sahel to the towering coils of the Ha, hairstyles served as identity cards, spiritual expressions, and even survival tools. Long before colonial disruption, African hair culture was a rich tapestry of symbolism, craftsmanship, and resistance. Let's begin in ancient Egypt's southern neighbor, Nubia. Nubian communities, often unfairly eclipsed in mainstream history, developed stylized braids and twists that communicated status, age, and clan. Nubian queens like Ameneter and Ameneseto wore complex braided wigs and headpieces that rivaled even Egyptian royalty, asserting their power and beauty in bold, unmistakable terms. Further west, in what is now Nigeria, the Yoruba and Igbo peoples were already treating hair as an artistic medium. Intricate styles weren't just for show. They were carefully planned with certain patterns reserved for brides, warriors, or spiritual initiates. Hairdressers were highly respected, almost priest-like in their roles. To entrust someone with your hair was to trust them with your essence. Among the Hema people of Namibia, red ochre paste made from powdered stone and butterfat is still used today to coat and sculpt elaborate braids. These ochre styles don't just protect hair from the desert climate. They signify everything from puberty to marital status. For Hema women, hair is literally shaped by the seasons of life. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of African hair history lies in how it encoded resistance. During the transatlantic slave trade, enslaved Africans used hairstyles as silent forms of rebellion and remembrance. Cornrows weren't just practical, they were maps. Some patterns symbolized escape routes or safe meeting points. Others preserved ancestral styles from back home, defying erasure with every twist and braid. In many West African cultures, shaved heads marked mourning or spiritual transitions, while thick dreadlocks could represent strength, connection to the divine, or warriorhood. Hair was sacred, never just aesthetic. Colonialism would later stigmatize these hairstyles, pushing Eurocentric ideals of beauty. But the ancient roots of African hair culture were never fully erased. They lived on in memory, in hands, in braids passed from mother to daughter, and are now being reclaimed around the world. In ancient Greece, where marble statues and epics shaped the Western imagination, hair wasn't just a matter of personal grooming. It was a public performance of virtue, intellect, and civilization. From the tight curls of Athenian youths to the flowing locks of philosophers, hair helped define who you were in the eyes of both the gods and your fellow citizens. Let's start with the men. Early on, Greek men often wore long hair tied back with ribbons or bands. Heroic heroes like Achilles and Odysseus are described in epic verse as having flowing or shining hair, symbolizing vitality, nobility, and divine favor. In these early periods, long hair was masculine and heroic. But by the classical era, things had changed. A well-groomed, moderately short haircut became the new ideal for Athenian men. The beard, however, stayed. It was the combo of choice for philosophers, statesmen, and teachers, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, all bearded. The beard was associated with wisdom and maturity, while the clean forehead and exposed face conveyed openness and reason. A long beard without long wild hair suggested intellect over impulse, logic over emotion. In contrast, slaves and foreigners were sometimes forced to shave their heads as a mark of submission or inferiority. So, in a strange twist, having hair, at least the right kind, was a political privilege. Women's hair, on the other hand, was deeply tied to domestic virtue. In public, respectable women were expected to wear their hair up and covered, braided or coiled into buns. Hair hanging loose was often reserved for specific rituals, particularly mourning or ecstatic religious practices like the Dionysian cults, where unbound hair symbolized a break from order and social norms. Girls wore their hair down until puberty, after which their first braid was often cut and dedicated to Artemis as part of a coming-of-age ritual. This act symbolized both the end of childhood and the beginning of societal responsibility. Greek goddesses also had signature hair. Athena's neatly arranged war helmet style symbolized strategy and discipline. Aphrodite's flowing curls represented sensuality and divine beauty. Hairstyles helped mortals align with deities, borrowing divine traits by mimicking their forms. In ancient China, hair was inseparable from moral philosophy, family duty, and imperial control. From the smooth-top knots of Confucian scholars to the ornate buns of Tang dynasty court ladies, every strand served a purpose, both aesthetic and symbolic. Hair was not to be altered lightly. In fact, cutting it was often considered a grave offense. Why? Because of Confucian filial piety. One of the core tenets of Confucianism was that your body, hair included, was a sacred gift from your parents. To cut, damage, or otherwise change it unnecessarily was a sign of disrespect. This belief permeated Chinese society for centuries. Even criminals faced hair, shaving not just as a punishment, but as a ritual humiliation and spiritual severance. Men typically wore their hair long and tied it into a top knot or bun. Scholars, poets, and officials would often pair this with long robes and caps, signifying wisdom, composure, and loyalty to order. To see a man with loose or unkempt hair in public was deeply unsettling. It implied madness, mourning, or rebellion. For women, hairstyles were highly age and status dependent. Young girls often wore twin buns or side ponytails, styles that marked them as unmarried. Upon marriage, a woman's hair would be restyled into a more mature and formal arrangement, often a single coil or bun pinned with combs, jade ornaments, or gold hair sticks. Cyrus set out to confront the Mage, a confederation of nomadic tribes living east of the Caspian Sea. These fierce horse-riding warriors were led by Queen Tamias, a ruler remembered as both a military leader and a symbol of defiance. Her people were seen by Persians as univilized but dangerous, a threat to the empire's expanding borders. The details of the campaign are murky, shaped largely by Herodotus' dramatic and likely embellished account. According to the Greek historian, Cyrus first attempted diplomacy, proposing marriage to Queen Tamaris. She saw it for what it was, a political ploy. When diplomacy failed, Cyrus resorted to trickery. He left behind a banquet of wine and rich food, knowing the Magi were unaccustomed to alcohol. After a drunken celebration, many of her warriors were ambushed and slaughtered, including her son. Devastated and enraged, Tamias swore vengeance. In the climactic battle that followed, the Mazarite overwhelmed the Persian forces. Cyrus was killed in combat. Herodotus even claims that Ptolemais had his body decapitated and placed his severed head in a skin filled with blood, declaring, "Drink your fill of blood, you who thirsted for it." While the gruesome ending may be more myth than fact, what's certain is this: Cyrus died during this campaign, far from the great cities he had conquered. His body was eventually returned to Pasargadae, the capital he founded in Persia, and buried in a modest yet dignified tomb, still standing today as a testament to his legacy. His death marked the end of an era. The throne passed to his son Kes II, who would continue the empire's expansion, notably into Egypt. But Cyrus's unique blend of tolerance, strategy, and visionary leadership would not be easily replicated. When Cyrus the Great died, he left behind more than a vast empire. He left behind a political blueprint, a philosophical precedent, and a reputation so revered that even centuries later, his name inspired awe. The Achaemenid Empire, founded by Cyrus, was the largest the world had ever seen to that point, stretching from the Ion to the Indies. But it wasn't just size that mattered. It was how it functioned. Cyrus's policies of inclusion, tolerance, and administrative innovation continued under his successors. His son Cambyses II and later Darius the Great didn't just expand the empire. They formalized its structure. The satrapy system Cyrus pioneered became a cornerstone of imperial governance. These regional governors maintained law and order, collected taxes, and answered directly to the king, allowing the empire to remain both vast and surprisingly efficient. Religious and cultural freedom remained official policy. Temples and local deities were respected across the empire, from Babylonian ziggurats to Egyptian sanctuaries. Local elites were often kept in power under Persian oversight, and rebellions were rare in the early Achaemenid years, not because of fear, but because many subjects found Persian rule less oppressive than the regimes they had previously endured. Cyrus also helped to establish the idea of kingship as a moral role, not just a political one. He wasn't merely king of Persia. He took on titles like king of the four corners of the world. But unlike the boastful tyrants of the past, his legitimacy was tied to the well-being of his subjects. This wasn't just propaganda. It reflected a real shift in imperial philosophy. Good governance was part of greatness. Even in death, Cyrus's influence was felt. His tomb at Pasargadae, a simple limestone structure, stood as a symbol of humility and permanence. Alexander the Great, himself a master of empire centuries later, visited Cyrus's tomb and reportedly paid homage, ordering its restoration after it was desecrated. In Persia, Cyrus was not just remembered, he was revered. Later Persian dynasties would invoke his legacy to legitimize their own rule. Zoroastrian priests associated him with divine justice, and Iranian national identity continues to celebrate him as the father of the nation. Cyrus the Great's influence didn't end with his death, or even with the fall of his empire. Over the centuries, his legacy grew beyond borders, faiths, and cultures, cementing him not just as a Persian hero, but as a globally admired figure whose example echoed through time. In the Hebrew Bible, Cyrus is described not as a pagan tyrant, but as a divinely appointed liberator. The book of Isaiah refers to him as the anointed of the Lord, a title otherwise reserved for Israelite kings. His decree allowing the Jews to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple marked a turning point in Jewish history. For many, he remains a righteous Gentile, a rare example of a powerful ruler who used his might to restore, not destroy, faith and freedom. In Greece, despite centuries of conflict with Persia, Cyrus was often portrayed as the model monarch. The Athenian writer Xenophon, a student of Socrates, wrote the Cyropaedia, a partly fictionalized account of Cyrus's life that presented him as the ideal ruler, wise, just, moderate, and brave. Though not a strict historical biography, it shaped Hellenistic and Roman thought about leadership and ethics for centuries to come. In Islamic tradition, some scholars and commentators have identified Cyrus with Dul-Qarnayn, the two-horned one mentioned in the Quran, a righteous king who built a great wall to protect people from chaos and injustice. While this identification is debated, it reflects the respect Cyrus commands across Abrahamic traditions. Modern historians and political leaders have also looked to Cyrus for inspiration. In 1776, Thomas Jefferson reportedly kept a copy of the Cyropedia at his bedside. In the 20th century, Iran's last sh invoked Cyrus as a symbol of national unity and reform. And today, Cyrus's Cyrus cylinder, often dubbed the world's first declaration of human rights, is displayed at the United Nations as a symbol of tolerance and governance. Cyrus's appeal transcends conquest. He's remembered not for cruelty or empire building alone, but for his rare ability to wield power with justice. He showed that an empire didn't have to crush difference to maintain control, and that rulers could win loyalty through respect, not fear. More than 2 millennia later, Cyrus the Great remains a paradox, a conqueror celebrated for his compassion, a king praised by those he conquered. Few figures in history command such wide admiration, and fewer still deserve it as much. In the blistering sun of the Nile Valley, the ancient Egyptians made a bold choice. Many of them shaved their heads. But this wasn't a practical decision alone. It was a symbol, a statement, a clean canvas. And upon that canvas, they placed some of the most elaborate wigs the ancient world ever saw. Wigs in ancient Egypt weren't just fashionable. They were essential markers of identity, status, and purity. Men and women of high rank didn't just wear them. They flaunted them. These weren't simple accessories, either. They could be made of real human hair, imported horsehair, or finely woven plant fibers. Wealthy elites often commissioned wigs with multiple layers, intricate braiding, gold beads, and even perfumed cone. Court ladies and empresses during the Tang dynasty took things to spectacular heights, literally. Their hair was sculpted into towering arrangements adorned with phoenix pins, flowers, and silk. There was also politics in hair. Dynastic shifts often brought forced changes in appearance. When the Manchu-led Qing dynasty conquered Ming China, they enforced the Q hairstyle, the front of the head shaved with the rest braided into a long pigtail. This style was a hated symbol of submission to foreign rule. Many Han Chinese resisted, choosing death over what they saw as a betrayal of cultural identity. In contrast, Taoist monks shaved their heads entirely to reject worldly attachments. Buddhist monks did the same, demonstrating their detachment from the material realm and their embrace of impermanence. In ancient India, hair wasn't just a physical feature. It was sacred. It intertwined with ritual purity, caste identity, and spiritual symbolism, becoming a powerful medium of both devotion and social control. From the twisted dreadlocks of sages to the shaved heads of pilgrims, hair in Indian culture told complex stories of belief, discipline, and transformation. Let's begin with the Sardis, wandering holy men who renounced worldly life. Their hair was never cut, combed, or constrained. Instead, they let it grow into thick, matted dreadlocks called jada. These locks symbolized their spiritual power and detachment from material concerns. The longer and wilder the hair, the more potent the message. This person had transcended vanity, family, and even identity. Sadhus emulated Lord Shiva, the god of destruction and meditation, whose own jada was said to hold back the mighty Ganges River. For others, however, shaved heads were the height of sanctity. In Hindu traditions, pilgrims often shave their heads before visiting sacred sites, offering their hair as a symbol of surrender and purification. Children's first haircuts, mundane, were key rites of passage, believed to cleanse bad karma from previous lives. Mourning rituals also required close male relatives to shave their heads, symbolizing humility and detachment from worldly attachments. Hair also communicated caste and marital status. Upper caste men traditionally kept a single tuft of hair at the crown, the shika, after shaving the rest of the head. This top knot wasn't random. It marked them as twice-born, part of the priestly or scholarly class, and obligated to perform sacred rites. Cutting the shika without cause was akin to social death. Women's hairstyles were equally symbolic. Unmarried girls typically wore their hair loose or in simple braids, while married women bound their hair into buns or coiled styles. A well-oiled, neatly braided style denoted discipline, beauty, and family honor. Ornamentation varied by region and wealth, but jasmine flowers, gold clips, and decorative combs were commonly worn during festivals and weddings. Hair was also linked to erotic power. Ancient texts like the Kama Sutra describe sensual hair arrangements, while sculptures at temple sites like Khajuraho depict women with intricately styled hair cascading down their backs like liquid sculpture. Throughout the ancient world, hairstyles weren't just about fitting in. They were also used to stand out, resist, and rebel. In many societies, changing or rejecting a dominant hairstyle became an act of defiance, subtle or overt, against cultural norms, imperial powers, or oppressive systems. Let's begin. In Judea, under Roman rule, the Jewish people, governed by strict religious law, avoided the elaborate grooming favored by Roman elites. Many Jewish men refused to shave their beards or style their hair in Roman fashion, preserving a distinct identity rooted in spiritual observance. To them, hair wasn't fashion, it was faith. And in an empire obsessed with assimilation that made their appearance a quiet form of protest. In ancient Gaul during Julius Caesar's conquest, the Celts were known for their wild lime-washed hair, standing stiff and bright, often spiked into mohawk-like crests. Roman writers saw it as barbaric, but for the Gauls, it was war paint in follicle form. The hairstyle both terrified enemies and bonded tribes in resistance to Roman occupation. The Parthians and later the Sassanids, two great empires east of Rome, also weaponized appearance. Their kings wore long curled hair and thick beards, symbols of divine authority and cultural pride. To the Romans, it looked exotic and effeminate. To the Persians, it was royal and ancestral. Their hair became a statement. We are not you. Even in more constrained societies, hair could be wielded as resistance. Enslaved people in various empires from Greece to the Americas were often forced to shave their heads to strip them of identity. But when they were able, they used hair to preserve lineage, memory, and rebellion. Braids concealed seeds, beads held meaning, and styles recreated maps, myths, or secret messages. Women, too, rebelled with hair. In Sparta, unmarried women famously wore their hair short, in contrast to the long locks of other Greek women, an expression of independence and readiness for physical activity. Roman women occasionally rejected the latest courtly trends to align with philosophical ideals such as Stoicism or early Christianity, embracing simpler, modest styles. And when emperors fell, their hairstyles fell with them. Cutting one's imperial-style hair could be a dangerous but bold statement of political allegiance or dissent. In all these cases, hair wasn't merely a mirror of the world. It was a tool to reshape it. Across ancient civilizations, when voices were silenced or swords were drawn, the scalp became a canvas of resistance. A braid, a buzz, a curl. It could shout louder than words ever dared.